In this module, we're going to be looking at the overlap between our very last cognitive concept, language development, and developmental psychology. In this particular class, what we're going to be doing is focusing in on some important terminology and concepts that are really related more to language than development. The reason why we need to do this is because I'm guessing most of us, unless we're English majors or some type of language majors, don't necessarily have a lot of familiarity with the terminology and concepts that developmental psychologists often link to kind of the formation of language at different points in our life. So this is going to be a slightly shorter video than usual, is my guess, but we are going to get to some critical terms and concepts. So if you need to watch this a couple times so you understand all these things before moving on to the next video, please do so. It'll help you immensely as you progress into the next one, where we do look at the changes on these terms and concepts throughout the lifespan. Before we get to the specific types of things that change and the terms that you need to know for that, I want to just first of all allow us to appreciate what it is we're talking about when we discuss this idea of language. Language has been around for thousands of years, and when we're talking about what language is, it's really any form of communication, either written, signs, spoken, or in any other medium that allows ideas and concepts to be sent from one person to another. Now, most of our research in psychology focuses on oral communication, the back and forth that people have. I guess if you get into social psychology, you can also talk about gestures, and this brings us into something called sign language, where you can not only send information via letters, but specific signals that indicate specific ideas or words. This is another thing that we can study in psychology. It's just not studied quite as often. The last form of language, which we obviously do look at in the sciences, but not as much in psychology, is written communication. Now, this has started to change a little bit in recent years as we've seen this upswell in texting and emailing and instead of computer communication. We've started to try to understand how that form of communication works and what it does differently from some of the other types of communication. But overall, research hasn't focused on written communication as much. But that doesn't mean that written communication isn't extremely valuable. In fact, most language researchers have contended that even though we rely a lot on oral language and sign language, the value, the kind of cultural utility of written language is immense, because when we have written language, we can convey ideas to individuals not only in the immediate moment, but say in extended times or in extended distances where we don't actually have to be physically present to get an idea across. Written language is definitely a beautiful thing. It's just not something we're going to dedicate a ton of time to in these classes. We'll look at it a little bit near the end of the second class, but not so much in comparison to the oral language and communication processes that take place there. That's going to be our primary focus in the majority of this class. Kind of underwhelmed by the importance of language. I thought I'd just come up with a list of a couple things that language allows us to do in written, oral, or signed form. One of the big things that we typically think of when it comes to communicating with language is it allows us to effectively communicate with each other, so kind of have ideas bounced off of each other in a very short period of time. It's much, much faster to have kind of an agreed upon way of, say, indicating something like a bear or a tiger, something that could potentially eat us, than it is to try to just come up with it off the cuff. It also allows us to quickly turn our attention towards specific topics instead of having to kind of figure out what in the world somebody is referencing. You might have encountered this with a friend where you don't have a perfect set of language when you're trying to get the other person's attention or get somebody to do something. So you start signing something or kind of trying to send a message in your own new invented way, and they probably struggle to understand what it is you were referencing. With the agreed upon languages that we have, that confusion goes away. And it allows us to not only draw somebody's attention to something and quickly, kind of effectively get that message across, but in those communications, suddenly people can learn things that they didn't encounter themselves, and you can actually experience differing perspectives on something. Usually when we talk about differing perspectives, at a basic level, it's just you get to see something else that somebody else doesn't get to see, but this also can relate to differing ideas and differing opinions on something that can be conversed on when people do develop language. What also makes this really neat is that the languages that we've developed have the ability to constantly be adding things and shifting things. There's a really cool topic that language experts studied called infinite generativity. And it suggests that once language gets large enough, you actually have the ability to produce kind of an infinite number of messages within the language barriers or constraints that you've created. Now, there's lots of applications to this, but one of my favorites in an academic setting is this issue with what sometimes pops up in a number of classes called plagiarism, when students argue that the phrasing and the combinations of statements that they made just so happen to perfectly overlap with somebody else's. This is a nice attempt at kind of trying to explain how some of these things occur, but what most people studying languages understand is that because there is an infinite number of ways to convey ideas, there is the possibility that two people might phrase something exactly the same, but for repeated overlaps to occur, there's a point where it's just almost impossible to assume that those overlaps are merely due to chance. And that's because almost every sentence we state, everything we do, can be phrased in an infinite number of ways. That's kind of an amazing thing if you think about it. It really shows how cool language is once we start to develop it, and it might give you a better sense of why some teachers, when you come up with that explanation that it's just random chance that your papers overlap to somebody, that they're not necessarily believing you that much. If we're looking though at language, we want to go more than just kind of talking about its utility and kind of the benefits of it. We also want to focus in on specific aspects to language that can develop throughout the lifespan or are really critical in each and every language medium that's out there. Now, we're going to talk about all the different rules and components to language that we have. We're probably going to want to start with the most basic elements to at least spoken language. There's other basic elements to written language like letters, but we're going to start with, again, spoken language. And if we do that, what we usually start with is this element called phonemes, and the basic sounds that are made in a language. And what we see with phonemes is that even though there's lots of overlapping phonemes from language to language, in spoken language, there are numerous cultures that have their own kind of phonemes that they use during the communication process. The classic example of this that many people usually cite is the rolled R in Spanish languages, where, or Spanish, or you understand what I'm getting at, in the Spanish language. The rolled R is something that's not really prevalent in the English language, but the th sound in English is something that's there that isn't prevalent in a number of other languages. And these kind of differentiations, these kind of unique things that exist within these particular languages, are just a very small sampling of all the different phonemes that might pop up in one language and not be existent in others. And if we're looking at development, we're going to talk a little bit later about how learning which phonemes to focus on is one of the first critical steps for many newborn infants. But just to try to understand how hard it is to hear each and every sound that's being made, I put a sentence down on the bottom of this slide. I remembered that I had to call Susie. And what I thought you could try to do is just identify the phonemes within it. First word's easy, I. There's only one sound that's made. After that, it gets a little bit more difficult. Is one phoneme and remembered. I is another phoneme. Me is another phoneme. M is the next one. B is the next one. Is the next one. And D is the next one. What you can see is that sometimes vowels are phonemes on their own, and sometimes they're not. There's also sometimes where two letters coming together make a phoneme that aren't just vowels and consonants. That is the classic example of two consonants coming together to make a phoneme. Now, we're not going to test you on how many phonemes are in a specific. Well, actually, yeah, I could. I will probably test you on how many phonemes are in a word just so you understand it, and you can appreciate how much value there is in learning just the basic elements of sound. And once you understand that, well, then we can transition to the next step, the next critical thing within. The next thing in spoken language that becomes critical are these things called morphemes. Essentially, you combine sounds together to start to create units of meaning. Sometimes words themselves are their own morphemes. Run is a great example of a word that's also a morpheme. But oftentimes, many words have multiple morphemes within them. So if I said the word runner, I'd actually be talking about two morphemes. Run, which is again its own morpheme, and which is a morpheme to explain one who. There's actually a whole bunch of research that goes into morphology and how it's formed, and also how it's ever changing. One of my favorite examples of a morpheme that many of you have probably heard is the word gate when it's added to the end of a specific word. It's odd, but the term gate at the end of anything like photo gate or house gate or whatever gate is a combination of whatever the first morpheme is, and then this second morpheme that kind of indicates some sort of a scandal or some sort of a controversy. It's odd, but it really highlights how, even though a lot of the morphemes that we use have been around for sometimes centuries, there are ways to come up with new ones. And it again speaks to the infinite generativity of language that we have. Once we've talked about morphemes and understand these basic units and how to put them together to create more complex meaning within the words we use, well, then we get into the next big thing of language called syntax. The kind of ways to appropriately organize words so that there's some logical sense to them. Syntax in spoken language is often very similar to syntax in written language, but there are some subtle differences. It makes it unusual when you start to read transcriptions of things that people said because we sometimes don't quite follow all the same rules and same norms that we would use in written language when we speak. But nonetheless, there is some form of syntax to pretty much all of our different mediums of language. And when we talk about syntax of language, again, we're talking about kind of the way that the order of the words we're using creates some special type of meaning. A great example of this is in that top statement, Bob went to Tom's house for a drink. What you see here is that there's a kind of an acceptable order of things or acceptable order of the words that kind of provides some type of meaning. You've got a subject, you've got an action or a verb, another subject, and then the kind of other combinations of things to explain what happened here. We're not, again, in an English class, so I'm not going to obsess about knowing all of these different nuances, just kind of the idea of what syntax is. And that, even if we use the same words in a slightly different order, Tom went to drink for Bob's house, and appreciate that that actually has no meaning because the order of the words doesn't necessarily work out. Now, that's also interesting is that much like we saw with our morphemes, there are differences across languages as to what syntax you need to pay attention to. For English, usually when we start talking about plurals, we usually add plurals to just the subject that's pluralized. So the cat versus the cats. Of course, we also have fun stuff in English with syntax where you've got the mouse and the mice. But in French, what's really cool is that their syntax requests that when you're talking about plural things, you usually describe the term in plural, but also the descriptor in plural. So it's not just le chat, it's les chats, which is the cats or the cats. It's kind of an interesting, subtle difference that again highlights how that even though each culture is using the pretty much the same guidelines for understanding language, the rules within the guidelines do sometimes subtly change. When we get to the end line of language, there's two other things that start to become very important. So once we've essentially learned the sounds we need to make, learned the units of meaning that are out there, learned the ways that we're supposed to organize those units of meaning into making coherent sentences, the next step is to understand kind of the actual meaning of what it is we're trying to say. And this deals with this topic of something called semantics. Most times, semantics is all about making sure that the order of our words not only matches what is needed, but is getting across a logical idea. My favorite example of kind of a need for semantics is the sentence down on the bottom of the kind of, I guess, right side of the semantics concept. You see in that statement, the grass watched the orange ear run the red shoe. Perfect syntax. The order of the words is exactly the way you would expect it to be with the kind of content of the words, or I guess the definition of the words that are there. But obviously, that statement is nonsensical. And this is where the difference between semantics and syntax starts to be identified. Now, there's also some really cool things when it comes to semantics that makes this even more complex. When, say, words have multiple meanings, you can really kind of appreciate how you really have to look at surrounding environments and cues to understand the exact meaning of statements. If I say the man batted his eyes while he hit the bat with a bat, it's a lot of bats. And the bat means different things in all three of these elements. And if you're thinking about where things should be and how this would make logical sense, you can eventually pull the semantics from that what might seem like a confusing statement off the surface on the surface. Another great example is I can my own vegetables while I can. Weird statement, but it makes perfect sense if you slow down and think about the context around it. That's what semantics are all about. There are other elements to language that get more fine-tuned as we get older, though. And this relates to really the last step in language that people do focus on, this idea of something called pragmatics, where it's not about conveying an idea as much as about conveying that idea in kind of a culturally appropriate way. Uh, we're looking at English, there's a difference when you're talking to adults and children and kind of what you should say to those individuals. A classic example is when you want something, you don't say usually, give me that. It's, can I borrow that? Unless there's some particular reason why, give me that is a more appropriate phrase. This is true in pretty much every language. In French and other Romance languages, sometimes there's kind of a formal way to ask something that kind of pluralizes who you're talking to versus kind of individualizes those people. And this is kind of persistent across almost all languages. There's not only kind of rules to language, but there's rules beyond the rules about when you're supposed to use certain elements of language in certain situations. And that's where learning pragmatics becomes really, really critical. When we look at language and how we develop those skills, what's really amazing to lots of researchers is that by the time most of us reach our adolescent years, most of us have actually all developed these basic skills. Now, there's great degrees of variability in terms of the semantic and the pragmatic skills and the types of words that people are using. We're going to talk about that later. But what's really wowed many language researchers over the years is the fact that almost all of us do get to an end line where we understand, even if we don't have words for, all of these different elements of language. And this led many people to wonder whether or not these language skills and learning them are just innate within human beings. And for a long time, it was just a subject of debate. But in the late 1800s, a really unusual, not late 1800s, sorry, late 1700s, early 1800s, a really kind of tragic incident occurred that shed light on the question of whether or not this was truly language, a truly innate thing. It was a sad case of a child that was discovered in France, in kind of the woods of France, that many people gave the name the Wild Boy of Avarin. This child had been discovered kind of unclothed, unkempt, and not necessarily doing so hot. And it led to all of these theories about him potentially being raised by wolves or being raised entirely in the wild. There's lots of people that reject this notion that a young infant could somehow survive in the wild on his own, and that a pack of wolves would somehow magically take this young infant into their fold, and that's how he survived. Some of the kind of more sensational rumors that were passed on at the time. But regardless of how the boy came to be and what happened, the amazing thing to researchers looking at him was that he had not developed any of the basic language skills that we thought for a long time were essentially innate in people and would be developed by the time we reached adolescence, which is about the age that this child was at. And this led to a lot of kind of poking and prodding and probably very tragic things that happened to him in the attempts of theorists and scientists to understand, what he meant for our understanding of language and our understanding of social norms for that matter. Unfortunately, there wasn't necessarily the ability to derive a lot from this child, but in 1970, a very similar situation like this occurred in Los Angeles, California, where a girl named Jeannie was discovered in her basement, and she had displayed pretty much the exact same language deficiencies as the Wild Boy of Avarin. Her case was extremely tragic, and the attempts to understand what this meant for language and how they could help her was something that we could document much better. And fortunately for us, we actually do have video footage and interviews that kind of highlight some of the take homes that we had from this very tragic case of the girl named Jeannie. And I actually provided the link for that video on the class site so you can watch that and really appreciate kind of the struggles that many researchers and counselors and people went through when trying to kind of balance this need to help this girl who was in a tragic case and kind of use what she was struggling with to better understand how language formed and kind of what happens to a person when they're not exposed to some of the things we just take for granted as human beings. It's important to note that when you watch that video and if you read about the Wild Boy of Avarin, we can't, from those examples, conclude that language is not innate. But what it might suggest to us is that, much like all of the other things that we tend to look at with development, the emergence of specific characteristics or specific skills is probably a byproduct of some biological predisposition and the right environment. And if we can understand kind of where things can go awry, it can allow us to look at development from a new perspective and maybe explore some of those timelines that we were looking at to appreciate the need for kind of the convergence of multiple things for certain things to pop up. That's going to mark the end of what we're looking at in this particular section. As I mentioned, this was going to be a little bit shorter. There is about a 10-15 minute video on Jeannie that I do want you to watch, so make sure that you also get to that. And then when you're done, we are going to transition from just talking about the basic elements of language and whether or not it's completely innate into how language develops. We're going to look at different age spans and what skills we start to develop, if it pops up and declines, what's behind it. And we'll even kind of revisit this idea of is language innate at the very end of our next lecture. So make sure that you, again, have studied up on these terms and concepts and that you're familiar with them. And when you're ready, I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, take care.